Please welcome to the stage Colin McCormick, Mary Dhillon, Gabe Messercola, and John Cornwell for a panel on integrating DAC with clean energy systems.
Okay, hello everybody. Colin McCormick, Carbon Direct. Thanks for sticking with us. We'll try to wrap up strong here. We'll try to save a few minutes for questions at the end, so please start thinking now about how to make us sweat at the end of this panel. I'm going to kick it off with two numbers that I want to frame our conversation before I introduce my excellent panelists. The first is 370 kilograms of CO2 per megawatt hour. That's the average carbon intensity of the United States electric grid. If you are using power from the grid to do DAC, that is the CO2 you are inducing at some power plant, some generator somewhere else. If you are using 2 to 3 megawatt hours a ton, you are therefore netting out at essentially nothing in net removal. That's why we hope for energy efficiency improvements for DAC. It's also why we look at clean energy sources. The second number I'm going to give you is 200 terawatt hours. That's the forecasted increased power demand from AI data centers in the United States by 2030. It's an enormous amount of electricity. Hyperscalers would love that to be clean electricity. So as DAC companies looking for clean electricity, that's the competitive landscape. Or perhaps we think about that as tailwind. Here's a wonderful driver for investment in clean electricity, and DAC can participate in that. So we'll touch on some of those topics today. Okay, with that framing, let me ask for a quick introduction for my panelists. And why don't we do introduction and one maybe high-level thought about where the market is today on clean energy for DAC in 2025.
Yeah, I can kick us off. I'm Mary Dhillon. I work in strategy at Fervo Energy. Fervo Energy is an enhanced geothermal developer. We're a late-stage startup with a pilot project operating in Nevada for the last 18 months. It's 3.5 megawatts powering a Google data center, as you so wonderfully walked me into that. And then our first greenfield project is in Utah, which will be a 400 megawatt grid-connected project coming online in 2 phases. So we're deep in construction right now for that first phase to come online in 2026. Why Fervo is interested in DAC? Why are we here? That's kind of going to lead into my overall thoughts about clean, firm energy in DAC right now. So geothermal is a great, clean, firm, baseload power resource. Transmission in America right now is very constrained. Utilities are constantly trying to figure out how they can continue to build out transmission and support more additional energy growth for things like climate tech, like DAC, as well as things like data centers. Our Utah project specifically is a 2 gigawatt geothermal resource that has been verified by independent engineers. Right now, it's only 400 megawatts because that's all the transmission we have. So if we're able to develop these geothermal resources up to a transmission constraint and then build out the rest behind the meter for DAC, that's going to be an amazing opportunity for synergies. Or, counterintuitively, if we can have public-private partnerships, we can de-risk the most expensive geothermal projects, aka the first well you drill at a new site, and build out the first megawatts for a geothermal project that can, again, be 2 gigawatts, but those megawatts go to DAC. And that's where public funding can really catalyze just overall energy growth.
Gabe.
Yeah, fantastic. I already introduced EDF Renewables, but I'll give a quick intro on myself. I've been with EDF since 2018. We're headquartered in San Diego, and I focus on what we call capital improvements, which scope formerly was really just looking at solutions for our existing assets, co-locating batteries to those assets that we develop, but that expanded into behind-the-meter business offerings, starting with data centers, but we also focus on restructurings, refinancing, divestitures, all sorts of stuff. So our team is kind of a Swiss Army knife team, and we're expanding our horizons to hopefully work on our development pipeline assets. So this co-location approach is something that's becoming a more popular topic in the industry, mainly driven by AI and data centers, but also the transmission issues we're talking about. We have a lot of great projects in our pipeline, some where I'm sure the geology aligns perfectly with DAC, but the transmission system isn't up to speed and available to take that power. So there's a lot of sites we're terminating or we're divesting from that could accommodate this, and I think it's we're at a tipping point. But in terms of where I think we're at right now with DAC, on the operational assets, there are real deal opportunities out there where projects could accommodate this. They have the geology or they have the well infrastructure nearby or on site. They may be diamonds in the rough, but they're out there. So I think it's a good stepping stone for us to prove the concept on existing projects and then take it to development next.
Great. I'm John Cornwell. I'm Director of Research and Policy for Good Energy Collective. We're a policy research think tank focused on nuclear energy and advancing nuclear energy as an important component of a just clean energy transition. In terms of, there's been a lot of development and exciting news in the nuclear space recently with, particularly around AI, with announcements of restarting 3 Mile Island and announcements with Amazon and Google for small modular reactor build-outs. In terms of integration with DAC, similarly to geothermal in some ways, has the potential to be a very important clean, firm power source for DAC. Your continuous source of clean power, typically operating above 90% capacity factors. There's also synergies, operational synergies in terms of both power and heat. So particularly with small modular reactors, there are some of the high temperature small modular reactors can generate heat up to 800 degrees C, and even waste heat from the pressurized water reactors can be at the 125 degrees C levels, which is still sufficient for variety of DAC applications, solid solvent applications, etc. Obviously there's scaling potential there as well, with the small modular reactors that are in development, opportunity to scale up sites as you need them with those, although they're several years away still. And speaking of that, in terms of current activity, there are 2 specific demonstration projects at the moment looking at direct air capture with nuclear, the Midwest Nuclear and DAC demonstration project, which is at the Byron plant in Illinois, and then CarbonVert in the University of Alabama doing another demonstration project with a feed study that's at the Farley plant in Alabama. So, yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So we have 3 generation technology families sort of on the stage here: geothermal, solar, wind, and batteries, and nuclear. Let's talk briefly about technical synergies. You sort of touched a bit on it, but let's go a little bit deeper on that. Are there technical reasons to match these particular generation sources with DAC? And what are those from a more technology and engineering point of view? Mary?
Yeah, so we are the prime recipient of the Red Rock Stack Hub, which is a TA1 feasibility study through the first round of funding. We've also done some work through the Chan Zuckerberg Institute on feasibility of direct air capture and EGS integration. The main learning from that is direct heat, which is something you've already talked about, but you can think nominally that geothermal capex is about 50% surface and 50% subsurface. That surface is what you need to generate the power, and then that subsurface is what's actually generating heat. So if you're able to find a low temperature DAC technology, so things that need less than 200 degrees C heat, you're able to cut the capex structure and unit economics of a geothermal plant in half. So if you're looking at a low temperature DAC sorbent technology, and you have 80% of your needs in the form of low-grade thermal energy and only 20% from high-grade energy or electricity, you're able to significantly bring down project economics. So that's the biggest synergy we've found. We found a lot of technologies and built a lot of relationships in this space to really leverage that. It also really widens the geographies you're able to deploy geothermal. We're on our first greenfield project right now. We have a lot of projects in the pipeline. Most of those are in the Mountain West. There's not a lot of geologic sequestration in the Mountain West. So if you're able to really leverage that direct heat application, you're able to broaden the geographies, try and go towards a geologic sequestration source, or sink. Source is not the right word. So that has led us into an application for the next round of DAC Hubs funding under the TA1 application of infrastructure access platforms for something that can develop 50 megawatts of electric energy and 150 megawatts of thermal energy close to a sink of CO2 or of geologic sequestration. Again, public-private partnerships, which is going to be kind of a theme through what I'm going to talk about today, is really important to make that scale, especially as we're working with still risky technologies and trying to finance these projects externally when we're pairing both EGS as well as pairing DAC is going to be a big challenge to overcome. But the technology integration is definitely there.
Super, okay, thank you. So yeah, Gabe, how does this look from your end, particularly in the context of what you just announced a few minutes ago?
Yeah, definitely. So I think, you know, it will take all types of generation, and there's many different kinds of DAC technology. So not a one-size-fits-all solution, but I think the advantage of intermittent wind and solar is it can be developed in most areas, and there's a precedent to developing that stuff. You don't need necessarily complicated subsurface rights with the landowners, and wind especially. Generally, our wind sites are quite large, so we have a large land footprint. We can introduce the DAC developers to those landowners and accommodate their system. So there's plenty of space. And then I think from a cost perspective, especially at these projects that have a lot of congestion, but I'm sure it's similar with both technologies. If there is congestion, you can sell that stranded energy for very low rates. So it's it takes a village. I hope we all have DAC at our projects, but what we need from the DAC technologies that would be at our projects is flexibility, right? Flexibility is key. Running a base load system with intermittent, and I'm sure we'll get there, just doesn't work.
Yeah, well, actually, John, we'll get to you in a sec, but maybe let's talk a little bit about that variability question and how what that looks like from the generator side. Actually, John, why don't I go to you, and then we'll talk about that flexibility, demand, and requirement on the DAC side.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I can be pretty quick with my remarks because I went through some of them in my opening remarks. But speaking. To the modularity point, a lot of things have to stack up, right, in order to make a project work, and the geology is a big one. So as we move towards the small modular reactors, modular nuclear reactors, there's that opportunity to potentially site that. You have more flexible siting. Also, I mean, it's not just in nuclear. It's not just advanced reactors and small modular reactors. There's an existing fleet of nuclear reactors, and there are potential opportunities there, particularly in competitive markets where those facilities are often exposed to very low prices when renewables are ramping up, and having an off-taker can help put a price floor for those facilities, which can help them with their project economics. But again, where that lines up is challenging.
That's okay. Terrific. Thank you. So then let's get in the commercial dimension of this, and I think this will get to some of that flexibility topic. So yeah, how do we look at commercial synergies between the power production generation technologies you're talking about, and then DAC, revenue stacks, operational profiles, that kind of aspect.
Yeah, so I think we're going to all touch on separate things, and it does definitely take a village of energy generation to scale an industry of this size. That's needed. But specific to geothermal, we have capacity factors close to 90%. So if you're looking for a continuous generating DAC facility, that is potentially one avenue to go down. That's not the only avenue, and there's different avenues for different approaches, but 90% baseload power is what we're looking at for geothermal. When we're talking about higher capacity factors at a no carbon emission while operational energy source, you're talking about increasing revenues on the voluntary carbon market as well. DAC doesn't currently, through 45Q, have any hourly matching or other policy-based incentives to ensure that all of the energy is clean at every hour you're operating, but it is simplifying the process of procuring that clean energy by co-locating on-site generation as well as on-site manufacturing of DAC and operation of DAC to match those same generation profiles that geothermal can offer.
Okay, super. Yeah, and Gabe.
Yeah, I think of it as a question we ask counterparties is your willingness to pay for flexibility, and we ask if your system can run 30%, 60%, 90%, 100% of the year. Some companies draw a line. You just can't possibly run at 30%, right? But what would your all-in energy price need to be to justify running at 60%? And we have a curve, and that curve, it's interesting from a data center perspective, that curve goes exponential, right? And so at 100%, things get very expensive. You double, triple, quadruple 90% pricing. But as you work your way down to 30%, the price gets very cheap. And so we are looking at that flexibility and the price associated with that. And the more flexible you can be, the lower the price you can achieve. And there's several reasons for that, but really it's just to do with the intermittency of the power. So that's sort of the formula we're looking at, and I think that's how we approach development as well. It's just that incremental 5-10% to get to 100% CFE is just very expensive to build out with renewables. You have to overbuild by a factor of 4 or 5 to the load size plus batteries, and so it's tough to get there with our technologies. But if you don't need that, we can work better with it. Yeah.
And then, John, do you take it?
Nuclear is similar in a lot of ways with geothermal, very high capacity factors, et cetera. I think that nuclear also has very high, obviously we all know very high capex up front. So the opportunities there for synergies between hyperscalers and DAC and nuclear is the opportunity there for value stacking on those projects can help with. So we've got obviously credits on the carbon side. There are credits available on the nuclear side as well through the 45Q. Then potential power sales, and then grid services as well, which is so.
Okay. Well, let's actually dive in a bit on the data center competitiveness question. We didn't prepare this as a discussion area, but I really think it's there. So how much should DAC developers be thinking of themselves as in tension and in competition with data center hyperscalers who have deep pockets and are willing to pay a lot for fast, possibly clean power? Are DAC developers gonna have to elbow their way in? Is flexibility their advantage over competitive AI data centers that want that power? How does that look to you guys when it comes to who your power goes to, who's bidding for your power?
Yeah, I can start off because I'm very interested from a geothermal perspective, how DAC can beat in AI, because stranded geothermal seems like an AI hyperscaler's dream situation. So, I'd imagine they'd have quite a high price. But on the intermittent, side, there's not a lot of data centers that are willing to be flexible. They want the 5 nines, 99.999% uptime, right? Because it's just so capex intensive, and so if we look at projects that have stranded generation, you have to come to the project. And a lot of those data centers aren't as geographically flexible as they may seem. They're certainly popping up all over, but they're still pretty rigid in where they want these things to go. They have their target markets, and on top of that, they need power from the grid. And in a lot of these markets, that the regulatory structure to allow you to both build behind the meter on a utility scale power plant, along with the ability to draw the power from the transmission system isn't there. So right now, ERCOT, Texas, is the only market where there is a clear structure. You can build a load on a generator and also draw power from the grid. So that's great for data centers. But outside of that, in a lot of markets, the interconnecting utilities are open to the behind the meter part of the deal, but they don't have the transmission capacity to serve additional, auxiliary demand from the grid. So that's the opportunity, right? A data center can't go there unless it's a crypto miner. But I don't want to make more Bitcoin. I don't want to make a ton of Bitcoin mining deals. I've become the Bitcoin person internally from our first deal, and never asked for this. But the beauty of that type of computing is it's flexible. Bitcoin mining is extremely price responsive, and it can ramp very quickly. And so they're able to handle intermittency, handle pricing to optimize the deal for both sides. So I think it's a good thing to emulate that type of flexibility, and it will lead to cheaper pricing overall.
Okay, so DAC's going to become the Bitcoin mining of the future. This is
the behind the meter structure came from oil and gas in Texas, the private use network it's called, and Bitcoin miners have been the catalyst for that type of innovation on the grid. So we have them to thank for this conversation. I mean, the deal we're doing with Return Carbon effectively is using the paper we made from that data center deal, and that's our deal structure. So it's they've created a really interesting way for us to monetize power that otherwise we would be maybe remedied in a decade if a transmission line is built or upgraded, but very uncertain, game of whack-a-mole. It might never come. So, but nuclear and geothermal, it's a harder thing to answer for you guys, I would say.
Yeah, you really throwing the hardballs out here. I mean, the first thing is 90% is way different than 99.9. Baseload power is a great thing for firming grid, firming relatively flexible offtake, like DAC could kind of plug and play, like you're saying. 99.999 is a crazy amount of redundancy. And we've looked in a lot of ways to be able to create that redundancy, and it's going in a lot of different directions. But the amount of overbuild necessary, or the amount of batteries necessary, or having grid redundancy and having to bill, and then you're negating time to power benefits of behind the meter generation is all necessary to get to those redundancy targets. So it's in the future, but I wouldn't say they're comparative exactly. There's still power. It's still a competitive environment to get power because people are trying to build AI data centers and have deeper pockets than most of the people in this room. But they're not exactly competition.
Okay, I think that's great. And then, yeah, John, any take on this?
Yeah, I don't know if I've got too much to add. This is pretty comprehensive. I think. Well, I'll leave it at that.
Well, I guess, the other way to frame this question is it a tailwind where deep-pocketed AI data center developers are investing in and helping draw forward clean power to the grid, and can support, and ultimately DAC developers will benefit from that. Won't be a competition, we benefit. So I think that maybe was a little bit of what I took away from the take of the competition isn't really head-to-head between data centers and DAC. So that's great if that's the case.
Yeah, and I would add, they want everything. They want gas backup. They want the wind and solar on site. They want the batteries, and it's the regulatory structure that's coming out of it. I think will benefit all of us. I think it's a better way to build power plants to have a local customer. So I think there's a bit of pricing uncertainty right now because they want every megawatt they can get. But like I said, I don't think it's direct competition.
Okay. Let's go to scale-up synergies. So to what extent does the development of clean power and development of DAC facilities share synergies in scale-up? There's a lot of challenges, Mary. You were talking about workforce and a number of others. Are there synergies in that scale-up challenge between the clean power provision and the DAC?
Who wants to start? Sure. Yeah, I'll focus my response on workforce because I think we're going to all say very similar things. So Fervo has been really focused on upskilling and transitioning workers. Geothermal has been a somewhat stagnant industry for the last several decades. It's been around for 100 years, and this is kind of the renaissance of geothermal. We have a lot of new next generation technologies coming to scale, and we're trying to make sure that we have the workforce to scale at the pace demand is requiring. So a lot of our employee base is actually ex-oil and gas workers. About 60% of our company is ex-oil and gas workers, and then most of our on-site employees are also ex-oil and gas workers. So there's kind of two prongs to this. One, it seems very easy to translate. It's great that there's an opportunity to translate. But a lot of the policies that's been written into tax credits require apprenticeship programs, which are not prevalent in the oil and gas industry. So extra work has been necessary to create apprenticeship programs, and we had one go live last year, to be able to get these tax additors for clean energy generation. I see these same challenges that we've had to go through into transitioning this workforce and upskilling this workforce over the last 3-ish years, that DAC will eventually have to go through as well. It requires a good, competent workforce that has a safety mindset and is used to working in operating facilities to go and work in a geothermal plant. It takes that same skill set, maybe slightly tweaked, to go work in a DAC plant. And when they're co-located, there could be a lot of synergies between what those apprenticeship programs look like, what those programs look like, what those relationship building exercises look like with local communities. And that's where a lot of partnership between off-taker and energy developer can really thrive.
Yeah, I can add one thing we're talking about with return carbon at the development happening in Texas is we have on-site O&M teams that are very skilled, and a lot of technicians that have experience across multiple kinds of generation types, batteries and inverters and on solar projects, and they're climbing towers and very skilled team. And so early stage we're seeing if maybe there's a synergy for our operation team to provide O&M services to the developer, given we already have a network of vendors and subcontractors and high voltage expertise in those areas. So EDF right now is not looking to be a developer currently, maybe one day for DAC, but I think the co-location approach has other synergies, right? O&M, landowner relationships, et cetera. So I think that's what I would add, but not sure if it's going to go that direction. So I'm looking at Martijn. We'll see.
John, yeah, from the nuclear.
Yeah, well, I'll have a slightly different tack actually. So and talk a little bit about permitting requirements. So there's it's a ubiquitous challenge across all large-scale infrastructure, and there are potentially synergies there as we're moving to develop different types of technology to especially around thinking about social license, community engagement work. There's opportunities to learn and share across that. So.
Well, maybe to dive in a little bit on that, is it likely to be easier to work with communities to jointly develop clean energy projects and DAC at the same time, or does that double your pain? How should we think about that co-development in the community engagement basis?
That's a good question. I don't know if I know the answer until we get there. But I think we can certainly. There are potential opportunity, greater opportunities for community benefits, et cetera. With multiple facilities, potential for creating industry hubs that have more than just DAC. You could, if we've got hydrogen production, synthetic fuels, et cetera, potentially there's greater benefits there. But
yeah, I think there's a strong value proposition for landowners, especially at projects that are already operational, because we have surface land control for large areas. not exclusively just where turbines are, but normally there's a pretty robust buffer area around those projects at a wind site, and those landowners couldn't enter into another lease with any kind of infrastructure developer, and so we're giving them an opportunity to basically lease the land twice, right? They have a wind lease, they have a surface level DAC lease, they would have a subsurface lease for pore space rights. So, new opportunities to monetize land, I think, is always a good selling point. But we've learned that through this work of sort of intervening on operational projects that these landowner relationships are key. And I think lessons from renewables to DAC, don't develop and lose those relationships. Like, stay engaged, do not abandon these communities, because it will come around to burn you, as it has with renewable energy many times. There's whole billboards, right, in the Midwest against solar development and stuff like that. And I think a lot of that was preventable if we had stayed engaged as an industry after developing, the first handful of projects. So don't be a developer that abandons the community.
I'll add one thing to that. So speaking of specifically our Project Cape in Utah, our first community outreach event was in 2020. So that'll be 6 years from first outreach to our first phase of our project coming online. That's because it's our first greenfield project. We've spent a lot of time engaging in that community. We've developed really strong relationships with that community, and two things come out of that. One, we really care about the partners that we choose to bring to that community. We care about that community, the sustainable growth of that community. And then two, we have those partnerships. So once we can be a avenue for introductions really with anyone in the county. So it's both a pro and a con. We are holding them close to our chests because we care about their growth, but we also are able to create those relationship introductions. That's not necessarily going to be the same for the next development. If we decide to co-locate at the same time, we won't necessarily have those long-term relationships, but in Utah, that's the current situation.
That's great. That makes a lot of sense. Let's turn to policy a bit here in terms of both challenges and opportunities. So where do you see challenges, where do you see needs, and where do you see opportunities in the policy landscape? And that's, I want to stipulate this federal, but also your experience at the state and local level as well.
Sure. I think there are, if we think about demand pool policies, I was talking before about the opportunity for stacking some of the stacking credits, et cetera. There are opportunities there. There are challenges there too in terms of there's a little uncertainty about whether you can stack. So sometimes you may need to have different developers doing different taking each piece. Yeah, then obviously continued need for research and development funding on the supply side, and is necessary across these technologies too.
Yeah, what is it?
Yeah, it might be similar to Mary, but I think the co-location as a concept is now becoming very popular, and FERC is having conversations about it. I think there needs to be a clear delineation between co-locating existing nuclear baseload, right, from co-locating to heavily constrained stranded intermittent renewables. These are two very different things from a grid reliability perspective, and I haven't unfortunately seen that conversation federally take place yet. Like, FERC had this whole conversation of co-location on generators, and it was all nuclear focused, mainly because of AI data center development, and I think we're missing something really important if we don't talk about curtailed power, stranded generation, and the issues on the transmission grid, because this is recourse for us to solve those problems and continue building a green grid. You need to overbuild these technologies. Yeah, FERC regulation ongoing. Well, hopefully it goes in the direction of co-location, just given the lobby that's involved there. I would think it would, but we'll see. And then from a deregulated power market perspective, ERCOT is in the lead on allowing this behind the meter structure. Other markets are slowly coming around, but it's very loose. And even in ERCOT's process, there's a lot of ambiguity. We actually found out we were AEP, who's the transmission distribution provider in the area for our first co-location at Las Mojadas Wind, we found out we were their first behind-the-meter pond project, and so they didn't know how the process was supposed to work with ERCOT, which when the utility doesn't know how it's supposed to work, that's a little concerning. But it's new, and I think it's blossoming, and so hopefully this, I'd rather have a longer process, but one that is clear than an ambiguous one.
That makes a lot of sense. So I'll not touch on either of those points because they both hold for geothermal. I'm going to touch on demonstration funding, which I think everyone in this room wants. Demonstration funding, the most excitement I've had in this space in the last probably 6 months was when the IIP TA1 opportunity from the second round of DAC hubs came out. Clean energy generation and storage and infrastructure to scale DAC is so important, and I feel like I've just been talking to everyone I possibly can over the last 18 months about how important it is, and then seeing focus on that and funds put towards that it was just so exciting. So hopefully those demonstration funding opportunities can continue to proceed forward once we're kind of out of this opaque transition period, but that's really the number one thing that I think is going to help scale geothermal, nuclear, behind the meter intermittent resources to power DAC and scale up DAC.
That's great. Okay. Thank you. We've got a few minutes for questions. I think there's a mic over here. Anybody want to raise your hand and get a question? Here we go.
Good afternoon, Glenn Marowitz from Clarity Technology. Really appreciate the information and thoughtful discussion. My first question, I can keep going until someone else wants the mic. I'm curious how you guys think about the risk of project financing, project risk for direct air capture at this stage. Gabe, maybe this is one for you, given the deal that you announced. What are you going to look for from DAC technology developers and project developers? What do you want to see from, in terms of offtakes, in terms of bankability, to make this interesting? I think the last thing that anyone wants, as you guys have said, are stranded assets that are generating power with no customers. So would love some thoughts on that from you guys.
Yeah, definitely. I think the first thing I would say is doing this at an existing operating project is really helpful because we're not financing anything. So, right, our risk tolerance is much higher in that kind of a situation. And I think the core thing we look for really is just ensuring that there's enough collateral in the power purchase agreement to cover us in the event of a non-payment, whereas traditionally when you're financing a renewable project, you need a much larger collateral package for the bank because you're financing based on the power purchase agreement coming along with that project. So with Return and the other deal we made with Soluna behind the meter, we set a market price to where above that market price, we can sell the power to the grid. And that also helps reduce the collateral that, the counterparties need to post. So we can do other things. We can bill biweekly instead of monthly. It's not ideal, but I can offer you a much smaller collateral package. So I think there are ways we can work together to find how to reduce the cost of doing this to bridge the gap to get to development. So I don't have the answer for development yet. Someone needs to, collateralize the deal. But I think if these things start popping up at existing projects, that's the de-risking that's needed to have a bank finance a development site.
Okay, super. Other questions? Oh, one in the back.
I'll see if I can keep this short. Just a basic question. So bringing clean dispatchable power to the grid versus bringing clean dispatchable power directly to a site, what are the implications, both social in terms of the equity of one type of development versus the other, as well as the project finance?
I wish Jesse was here. He would be able to speak on this really well, but I can try and parrot his research as best as I can by saying that it's always going to be better from an emissions perspective to put that on the grid where you can. So that's how we've developed our strategy of build projects to a interconnection limit. Similar to onshore oil and gas, the more wells you drill in a reservoir, the cheaper each marginal well is in that reservoir. So every marginal electron from one of our developments is going to be the cheapest electron we can develop. So that's our incentive to continue to build out these resources. And that's where DAC or other behind-the-meter solutions come in. But yes, it is always going to be better to put that low-emission, high dispatchability power source on the grid first.
Yeah, and I think the second part or other part of your question was from a sort of social license to operate question. So here's all this clean power. Is it just going to a DAC facility and the community is not getting that clean power? Is that's sort of the perception or the concern that I think you're raising. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I would add that's tied into the performance assurance or collateral point I mentioned. There's a price of power on the grid at which the counterparties are willing to curtail their systems, and this gets into the flexibility thing. But it also gets into the defense of behind the meter not taking generation off the grid, right? Like when the grid is peaking in price and it's telling us that it wants our energy, which a lot of times isn't happening, right? We are stuck with a lot of negative pricing and intermittency peaks and prices drop down, so there's a negative correlation there. But when it does happen and there are these small amount of hours every year where we can make a large amount of our revenue and serve the grid, it's a win-win. But it comes down to a counterparty being willing to curtail in those moments. So I do think flexibility is also part of the social license to do this deal structure.
I'll add one comment from some work we've done, which is off-takers of DAC credits think very carefully about the LCA, what that looks like, what the gross to net tons are. And there are different views on what the right accounting process is for power source from the grid. So there's complexities that come in with that, whether you use an annual average carbon intensity of your local balancing area, whether you use some sort of short-term marginal emissions number. Standalone power, behind the grid power, behind the meter sort of solves that in a sense. But I think these challenges about how the dust is going to settle on emissions accounting frameworks as adopted by GHG Protocol and others, it's going to remain relevant in a lot of cases. Any other questions? We've got a few more minutes. No? Anything we didn't touch on there? I feel there were a couple other. If there's no other question, I do want to come back to one issue around supply chains. If you had all the capital in the world, could you build is the supply chain there to build all the power we need for gigawatt scale DAC, or are we constrained on that?
I can talk about our supply chain. We're currently working to ramp it up considerably. The biggest current bottleneck is ORC turbines, so organic break-in cycle turbines. Again, geothermal has been a fairly stagnant industry, so there has been no need to ramp up. That's where we've been really strategic with who we have invited in as investors and who we have partnered with as supply chain suppliers. So we currently are procuring Turboden ORC's turbines, which is a Mitsubishi Heavy Industries company, and MHI is also a investor in Fervo. So trying to develop strategic partnerships is how we're trying to scale up that supply chain. But depending on the speed, I think supply chain's not the only thing that's in capital are not the only two things that are limiting that growth rate.
Yeah, I would say right now the critical path would be probably the geological piece, and at the moment, like the lead time is increasing on medium and high voltage equipment, of course, and that's AI driven, and mainly main power transformers and even breakers now take quite a while to get. So lead time is increasing, but a large 90+% of the queue is renewable energy, right? And so we've been building to this scale already. The intention was to, fully green the grid, and that the industry's been on that track. So I do think the energy can be there. It's just establishing the right path and ensuring that you're ordering equipment in the right timeline sequence with the geology piece of the deal. Yeah.
And then, on the nuclear.
Yeah, from a nuclear perspective, I think in a world where we could scale up infinitely, or to where we need to, that there are several constraints in supply chain. So workforce is definitely one that we've already touched on. Fuel supply on the nuclear side is a big one, especially if we're thinking about where enrichment supplies are, and they're Russia and China, so there are national security implications there as well, and then hardware, and then another big one is waste. So on the tail end, what happens with waste?
Okay, thank you so much. I think we're just out of time. Appreciate it, and thanks everybody for the end of the day attention. If you have any questions that we didn't get to ask, please just come talk to us afterwards. Thank you.